Type 2 diabetes, that's the form of diabetes which comes on in adulthood, is growing into a global epidemic. It can cause blindness, heart disease, strokes, and kidney failure, to mention but a few. The treatment is pretty standard, tends to be focused on diet, exercise, weight loss, controlling the blood sugar and risk factors like cholesterol and blood pressure. Type 2 diabetes, that's their form of diabetes which comes on in adulthood and it's growing into a global epidemic. It can cause blindness, heart disease, strokes and kidney failure, to mention but a few. The treatment is pretty standard, it tends to be focused on diet, exercise, weight loss, controlling your blood sugar and risk factors like cholesterol and blood pressure. But despite all that, diabetes often marches on and causes havoc. The question is why? Well, an astounding study from Sweden has suggested a reason. Analyzing data from thousands of people, followed from their new diagnosis with type 2 diabetes for some years, they found 5 different patterns with their own risks of complications and need for treatment. How did you classify? So you've got these people with diabetes, how did you classify them? You did 6 different tests on them. Yes, we have been for 100 years diagnosing diabetes by measuring only one thing, blood sugar. We thought that we will add a few more things. So we added measurements of insulin secretion, how sensitive they are to insulin, also took into account body weight or body mass index, and long-term glycemic control, and then we fed these 6 variables into their computer and asked how many forms of diabetes do we have, and we got the answer 5 and then we replicated it in 3 independent populations. So we were pretty sure that the answer was 5 different types of diabetes. And just before you go on, I need to explain a couple of things. So when you are looking at insulin, one of the things that typifies type 2 diabetes is that you can produce a lot of insulin, so that's the insulin level, but the body can be resistant to the effects of insulin, which is why the blood sugar goes up, and that's one of the things that you are talking about there, and these long-term controls and other of these variables. So just briefly, what were the 5 different types? Let's say type 1 or what we call cluster 1, that overlaps with type 1 diabetes, so they clearly have these what we call an autoimmune destruction of the insulin-producing cells. But now they are adults. Type 1 usually occurs in children. And then cluster 2 was quite large, 20%, it was insulin deficient, as type 1, but they had been diagnosed as type 2, they received the treatment for type 2, metformin, and had very poor metabolic control and had a high risk of developing diabetic eye disease. So they clearly need intensified treatment in the future. Cluster 3 was about 15%, as you mentioned, and talked about insulin resistance. They were really the insulin-resistant group. They had surprisingly good glucose or blood sugar, but they had a 45-fold increased risk of developing diabetic kidney disease, kidney failure. Then we had cluster 4, which is related to obesity, and cluster 5 to age. They both accounted for about half of the patients, with very mild forms of diabetes that don't really need more than some lifestyle advice, probably metformin, and they don't really need to see a doctor as often as currently recommended. I think in the future we should focus on the 3 severe forms. Right, so these were the elderly people were the last ones with the more benign. And when you say metformin, metformin is one of the older drugs for use in type 2 diabetes, which is pretty effective, helps you lose weight and keeps the blood pressure under control, and it may even prevent cancer as well. It's effective, I don't know, it's a very vile drug, but it works and it's quite cheap. So you were saying that you identify the 3 who are at Higher risk, the younger people who are who have relatively poor control, people who are insulin resistant but high risk of kidney disease, and the other group which was high risk of other diabetic complications such as the eyes. Do we know what to do about these? Now you've identified these 5 different groups, do you actually know what to do, or there's a whole research agenda about that? In other words, should GPs in Australia start doing these 5 tests on everybody with diabetes? 6 tests. Well, what actually they need to do is to measure something. It's a product of insulin called C-peptide, because that we use then to estimate insulin secretion and insulin sensitivity, and they have to measure autoantibody to those insulin-producing cells. But I can see that it's early for GPs, so what we're trying to do is develop what we call a clinical physician support system, which is actually a GPS or a computer program. So if they measured these from the newly diagnosed patients, then this computer program would tell each group what treatment, what are the risks with treatment and things like that. So we hope that we would have that available in a year. We will start to test it probably still during this year, but hopefully it will be available even in Australia. Even in Australia. Some things do get to us sometimes, we never know. And presumably in this older group of people, which is quite a large group with type 2 diabetes, it would actually save on treatment. You don't need to do that much. In the long run we think that this new classification even might save money for the society and also for the patients. I think for them it's good to know that, okay, I have a mild disease, but I